The neurology department at Manchester's St. George's Hospital was in the usual bustle. Stella Brown mechanically adjusted the name tag on her white coat and tiredly glanced at her watch. It was 7:30 in the morning. Her night shift was coming to an end, but the fatigue that had accumulated over the past 12 hours seemed insignificant compared to the burden of thinking about her home life. The hospital corridor was bustling with nurses handing over their shifts, orderlies delivering breakfast, and doctors already starting their morning rounds. Stella tried to concentrate on filling out the paperwork, but her thoughts kept returning to yesterday's conversation with her son. "Mom, all my classmates are going to preparatory courses. How will I get into medical school without them?" Michael's words still sounded in her head. "Stella, you seem distracted today," Nancy, the head nurse, said to her, putting her hand on her shoulder. "Did something happen?" Stella tried to smile, but it came out forced. "I'm fine, just tired. Michael was studying for his exams for a long time yesterday, and I barely slept before my shift." "And how are things going with paying for the preparatory courses?" Nancy asked cautiously, sitting down next to her. Stella sighed as she shifted the folders with the medical records. "John is behind on his child support payments again. He says his new company is having financial problems, and the courses cost a fortune." She trailed off, noticing how her voice was trembling. "You know, my sister works in a private clinic," Nancy began. "Maybe I could—" She was interrupted by the loud sound of an ambulance siren. A moment later, a nurse on duty ran into the emergency room. "We need help now. We have a new patient, a stroke." Stella quickly got up and headed for the emergency room. There, doctors were already bustling around an elderly man on a gurney. His face was disfigured. The right half of his face was sagging. His eyes looked with horror and incomprehension. "Richard Anderson, 78 years old," the paramedic reported. "Found by neighbors in his own home. Approximate time since symptom onset, 6 hours." Dr. Williams, the neurologist on duty, quickly examined the patient. "We need a CT scan of the brain immediately. Stella, are you still on shift?" "Yes, for another half hour," she replied, already helping to move the patient to another bed. "Great. Take the patient to the CT scan and monitor his condition." The next 20 minutes flew by in a rush. Stella stayed by Richard's side, monitoring his vital signs. She noticed that when she spoke to him in a calm voice, his heart rate slowed down a bit. "Don't worry, Mr. Anderson," she said gently, adjusting the drip. "You are in good hands. We will do everything necessary." A grateful look flashed in his eyes, and he tried to say something, but only an incomprehensible wheeze escaped his throat. Stella saw the fear reappear on his face. "It's normal," she continued soothingly. "After a stroke, people often have problems with speech. But this is temporary. The main thing now is not to panic." After the CT scan, Richard was transferred to the intensive care unit. Stella helped to arrange him, checked all his vitals, and started filling out the documentation. In the patient's personal belongings, she found a wallet with documents and an old cell phone. "Mr. Anderson," she said to the patient, "we need to contact your family. Do you have any contacts on your phone?" Richard closed his eyes and nodded weakly. Stella picked up the phone, but it turned out to be dead. "That's okay," she said. "We'll find a way to contact your loved ones." At that moment, a young nurse, Lucy, entered the room. "Stella, your shift is over. You can go home. I'll take over the patient." Stella looked at her watch. Indeed, it was already 9:30. She knew that her son was waiting for her at home, and she had to prepare breakfast before he left for school. But something in Richard's eyes made her hesitate. "Lucy, do you have a lot of patients today?" she asked, noticing her colleague's tired appearance. "Terrible," she sighed. "2 nurses have come down with the flu. I have 15 patients today. I can barely cope." Stella looked at Richard, who was helplessly trying to get their attention. There was such a desperate plea in his eyes that she couldn't just walk away. "You know," she said after a pause, "I could stay a few more hours. I can help with the new patient until you find a replacement for the sick ones." "Are you sure?" Lucy was surprised. "You have a son." "Michael is old enough to make his own breakfast," Stella smiled, pulling out her phone to text her son. Something like relief flashed in his eyes, and Stella felt her tiredness slowly recede. It was going to be a long day, but she was ready for it. The day at St. George's Hospital was gaining momentum. Stella had just finished helping Richard with his morning procedures. She noticed that the patient was trying to say something, but could only make slurred sounds. His right arm was lying helplessly on the blanket. "Do you want some water?" she asked, watching his reaction carefully. Richard nodded slightly. Stella poured water into a special cup with a spout. "Let's try it together." "Slowly," she said gently, supporting his head. The first attempt was unsuccessful. The water ran down his chin, causing the patient to cough and panic. His eyes widened with fear, his pulse spiked. "Quiet, quiet," Stella said soothingly, wiping his face with a napkin. "It's okay. We'll try something else." At that moment, her phone rang. Michael appeared on the screen. Stella hesitated but answered. "Hi, honey." "Mom, when are you coming back?" Her son's voice sounded anxious. The school said that he had to pay for the preparatory courses immediately. Stella took a few steps away from the bed. "Michael, I'm going to be late today. The hospital is short-staffed." "But Mom," her son interrupted her, "you promised we'd go to the bank today." "I know, dear." But now, she was interrupted by the sharp sound of the monitor from the ward as Richard had another panic attack. "Michael, I have to go. We'll talk tonight, okay?" After hanging up the phone, Stella hurried to the patient. Richard was breathing heavily, his face distorted with fear. "I'm here," she said, taking his left hand. "Breathe with me, slowly. Inhale, exhale." Gradually, the patient's breathing returned to normal. Stella noticed that the standard methods of care were clearly insufficient for his condition. An hour later, Nancy came into the room. "It's difficult," Stella sighed. "Swallowing problems, constant panic attacks. He needs special care." Nancy put her hand on her shoulder. "You know, you don't have to stay." "I do," Stella interrupted. "Who else can do it?" At that moment, her phone rang again. This time, it was her ex-husband. "Stella," she heard a familiar voice. "About the alimony. John, you promised to pay last week. The company's in trouble. Maybe next month." "Next month?" Stella felt her voice tremble. "Michael needs the money for the course now." "I can't help it," he said indifferently. "I have a new family, other expenses." Stella hung up the phone, trying to hold back her tears. 5 years after the divorce, and he still knew how to touch her. When she returned to the room, she noticed that Richard was watching her. His eyes were filled with sympathy. "It's okay," she smiled, wiping her eyes. "Let's try something new with the swallowing." Stella spent the next few hours developing special exercises for Richard. She recalled the techniques she had learned in her advanced training. Small steps, but they made progress. By the end of the day, Richard was able to drink a few sips of thickened liquid without coughing. Before going home, Stella checked all the vitals again. Richard seemed calmer, although fatigue was evident on his face. "We'll continue tomorrow," she said, adjusting the blanket. "You did well, Mr. Anderson." On the way home, Stella smelled the smell of fried potatoes. Michael had made dinner. She may have had a lot of problems in her life, but moments like this made her realize that everything was not in vain. "Mom," Michael looked out of the kitchen, "I made your favorite potatoes." Stella hugged her son, feeling her fatigue slowly recede. "Thank you, dear. Will you tell me how your day was?" It's been a week since Richard Anderson was admitted to the hospital. Stella has started coming to work an hour earlier to give him extra lessons. She developed a special system of exercises, combining her experience and new techniques she found in the medical literature. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she greeted as she entered the room. "Are you ready for our morning exercises?" Richard smiled weakly on the left side of his face, which was progress. A week ago, he couldn't even do that. "First, let's stretch your facial muscles." Stella took out a small mirror. "Look at your reflection and repeat after me." She began to perform simple facial exercises, puffing out her cheeks, stretching her lips, sticking out her tongue. Richard repeated diligently, although the right side of his face was still poorly controlled. "That's great," Stella encouraged him. "Now let's try—" She was interrupted by a knock on the door. An elegant woman of about 45, dressed in an expensive business suit, entered the room. "Excuse me, is this Richard Anderson's room?" she asked with a slight accent. Richard's eyes suddenly filled with tears. He tried to say something but could only make a slurred sound. "You must be Catherine," Stella guessed. "I'm Stella Brown, your father's nurse." Catherine nodded, keeping her eyes on her father. "I just flew in from Switzerland. The hospital called me a few days ago, but I couldn't get away sooner. Important negotiations." Her voice trembled and she fell silent. Stella noticed Richard's shoulders tense. "Your father is making great progress," she said softly. "Would you like to see?" Without waiting for an answer, Stella pulled a special cup out of her locker. "Mr. Anderson, shall we show your daughter what we have learned?" Slowly but surely, Richard took a few sips of water. Catherine raised her eyebrows in surprise. "But I was told he had serious swallowing problems." "He did," Stella smiled. "We've been working on it a lot. Look." She showed Catherine the special exercises she and Richard had been doing. She told her about massage techniques to improve blood circulation, about methods of restoring speech. "Do you do all of this as part of your standard treatment?" Catherine asked. "Not really," Stella admitted. "I come early so I have more time to practice. Your father is a very diligent patient." Catherine watched in silence as Stella continued her lessons with her father. At some point, Richard was able to clearly pronounce cat, the first word he had spoken all week. Tears appeared in his daughter's eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, taking his hand. "I'm sorry that I came so rarely. Work, constant business trips." Richard gently squeezed her fingers. Stella quietly left the room, giving them the opportunity to be alone. In the hallway, she bumped into Nancy. "You're home early again?" the head nurse asked. "Stella, you do realize you're not getting paid for these hours, right?" "It's not about the money," Stella replied, remembering the joy in Richard's eyes when he was able to say his first word. In the evening, when Stella was about to go home, Catherine approached her. "Miss Brown, can I see you for a minute?" They went to the window in the hallway. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in warm shades of pink. "I want to thank you," Catherine began. "What you're doing for my father, it's more than just a job." Stella shrugged. "It's normal. Everyone deserves a chance to get back to normal." "Do you have children?" Catherine suddenly asked. "A son," Stella answered. "Michael. He's 15. He must be proud of his mom." Stella remembered her conversation with her son yesterday about the unpaid courses and smiled sadly. "I'm just trying to do my best." "You know," Catherine said thoughtfully, "watching you today, I realized how much time I wasted by getting caught up in my work. Dad was getting old and I kept putting off visiting him. I thought I would have time later." "It's never too late to start over," Stella replied gently. Catherine nodded and suddenly said decisively, "I'm going to stay in Manchester, at least until Dad is fully recovered. The job can wait." Stella woke up to the sound of her alarm at 5 in the morning. Her head was buzzing after a short sleep. She had stayed up late last night helping Michael with his exams. They still hadn't found the money for the courses, so they were studying on their own, using old textbooks and videos from the internet. "Mom, are you getting up?" My son's sleepy voice came from the next room. "Go back to sleep. It's still early," she replied, trying to keep her voice down. "You're leaving early again because of that patient?" Michael's voice sounded resentful. Stella stopped outside his room. "Honey, Mr. Anderson needs help. You realize—" "I do," her son interrupted. "As well as the fact that we can't afford to pay for the courses because you're working overtime without pay." These words stabbed her heart. Michael was right. The extra hours didn't bring in any extra income, but she couldn't abandon Richard now that he was making progress. An excited Lucy met her at the hospital. "Stella, it's good that you're early. Mr. Anderson had a rough night." Stella hurried to his room. Richard was awake, his face pale, dark circles under his eyes. "What happened?" she asked, checking his vitals. "Several panic attacks during the night," Lucy answered. "Catherine had just gone to the hotel to rest, and she's been here all night." Stella sat down by the bed. "Mr. Anderson, let's try to understand what is causing these attacks, shall we?" Richard slowly raised his left arm and pointed to his right side, which was still immobile. "Does it scare you that your arm doesn't obey?" she asked cautiously. He nodded, and tears appeared in his eyes. "You know," Stella took his hand, "stroke recovery is a marathon, not a sprint. Every small step is a victory." They spent the next few hours doing new exercises for his right arm. Stella used techniques she had read about in medical journals: light massage, passive movements, exercises with a small ball. Around noon, Catherine returned. She looked tired, but calmer than yesterday. "How is he?" she asked Stella, taking her aside. "Better. We are working on the mobility of his right arm." Catherine nodded. "You know, I've been watching you these days. You do so much more than your job requires." "I'm just trying to help," Stella shrugged. "No, it's not just helping," Catherine insisted. "I see you coming in early, staying late. You invent new exercises, talk to him." At that moment, Stella's phone rang. A message from the landlord appeared on the screen. "The rent is overdue. I'm waiting for you by the end of the week." Catherine noticed Stella's face change. "No, everything's fine," she replied quickly, hiding her phone. "Excuse me, I need to check on some other patients." The day dragged on for a long time. Stella tried not to think about the bills that had piled up at home, the need to find money for Michael's courses, the overdue rent. She focused on her work, on her patients, especially Richard. When she returned home, she found her son studying. Michael sat among the scattered textbooks, rubbing his eyes tiredly. "How are you doing?" she asked, sitting down next to him. "Fine," he grumbled, "although it would be easier in the classroom." Stella hugged him. "I know, darling, but we'll manage. We've always managed, haven't we?" That night, Stella couldn't sleep for a long time, thinking about how to balance her responsibility to her patient with her duties to her son. She didn't know the answer, but she felt she was making the right choice in helping Richard. 3 weeks have passed since Richard Anderson was first admitted to the hospital. Stella was walking to work, enjoying the early spring sunshine. Yesterday, her son Michael told her that he had passed his biology test with flying colors. Upon entering the hospital, she immediately noticed an unusual amount of activity outside Richard's room. Catherine was talking to Dr. Williams, holding some papers in her hands. "Ah, Stella," the doctor called out to her. "It's good that you're here. We have great news. Mr. Anderson is ready to be discharged." Stella felt her heart skip a beat. She knew this day would come, but she didn't think it would be so soon. "Good morning, Miss Brown," Richard greeted her in a clear, though still slightly slow voice. His right hand could already hold the cup, and his face had almost completely regained its symmetry. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she smiled. "I see you're in a great mood today." "Thanks to you," he replied, and tears appeared in his eyes. Thanks to you, I can talk again, move again, live again. Catherine came closer. Stella, can I see you for a minute? They went out into the hallway. Catherine looked worried but determined. I know about your situation, about your son who is preparing to enter medical school, about the financial difficulties. Stella tensed. This is not— Please let me finish, Catherine interrupted her gently. You spent countless extra hours with my father. You came early, you stayed late. You developed special exercises, supported him morally, and all of this at no extra charge. Stella wanted to object, to say that she was just doing her job, but Catherine continued. I run a medical company in Switzerland. We have a branch here in Manchester, a private clinic called St. Elizabeth's. We are looking for an experienced rehabilitation coordinator. But I'm just a nurse. You are much more than a nurse, Catherine said firmly. You have something that can't be taught, a real commitment to patients, the ability to find an individualized approach, the ability to persevere even in the most difficult situations. She handed Stella an envelope. Here is a job offer. Salary is twice as high as your current salary, flexible hours and opportunities for professional development. And one more thing. Catherine pulled out a second envelope. This is a grant for your son's education. Full payment for his medical education at the University of Edinburgh, including preparatory courses. Stella felt her legs give out. She sat down on the nearest chair. I can't take it. Yes, you can, Catherine said gently. You gave me my father back. Not only physically, but you helped us restore our relationship. I realized how much I had lost, immersed in my work and forgetting the most important things. At that moment, Richard looked out of the room. Catherine? Stella? Are you okay? They returned to the room. Richard was sitting in a chair, ready to be discharged. When he saw the tears in Stella's eyes, he was worried. Is something wrong? Everything is fine, Dad, Catherine smiled. It's just that sometimes good things come back in unexpected ways. In the evening, Stella returned home with 2 envelopes in her bag and a new feeling in her heart. She remembered that first day when she decided to stay after her shift. At the time, it seemed like the right thing to do. Now she realized that this decision had changed not only Richard and his daughter's lives, but also her own. Michael met her at the door. Mom, you're home early. Why are you crying? Stella hugged her son. Because sometimes life throws us incredible surprises. Do you remember how you dreamed of going to medical school in Edinburgh? Now we can. She smiled through her tears. Now we can do anything. Stella thought that sometimes the most important moments of our lives begin with a simple decision, to stay and help, even when it is difficult. Because true kindness always finds a way to return.